Good evening, I'm Joffre. And my question is, why the focus on nationalizing the alternatives rather than nationalizing the fossil fuel industry power plants who threaten to close if certain policy actions are taken? I think we're kind of taking the perspective in reverse, because if we remove the subsidies and tax the mineral extraction, we will have no choice but to pass on that taxes to intermediate industries. It would give alternatives a better chance and attract more private enterprise and capital. That's my basic question. Thank you.
Okay, that's primarily for you.
Well, one of the problems about renationalising large coal-fired generators is you're spending a huge amount of public money to buy an asset that you want to shut down. And the corporations that bought them, or in some cases like Liddell got given it, will just make a windfall profit in that renationalisation at the cost of the taxpayer.
But
it's also a deeply unattractive policy to sell to the public. Like, let's spend billions of dollars to buy a bunch of assets that we want to then, shoot to the moon, shoot into the sun. If you want to get people inspired by a project, you want to get the public on board, you've actually got to have a positive vision. And the positive vision for me is what we can build and what we can produce and what the future will be. And if the future, I believe, is publicly owned, 100% publicly owned renewable energy that at different times gives you energy for nothing, because that's one of the benefits of renewable energy. At different times, the spot price in South Australia at the moment is $0 for the cost of producing electricity. That's the future that we can actually get people mobilised around. But it's pretty hard to mobilise a movement into buying ageing, decrepit, previously publicly owned assets at the cost of billions of dollars to deliver short-term windfalls for corporates, and then we shut down the assets. It's as much the political reality as it is a kind of economic reality.
I don't think you understood my question. I didn't say buy. I didn't say buy. I think you misunderstood my question. I didn't say buy it. They're going to close it down anyway. I'm saying take it over. That's free.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I'd be all for just seizing these assets because I personally think that they are deeply environmentally destructive. But then we need a policy that's attached to political reality in Australia, and I don't think that is attached to political reality. If we're going to go out and talk to coal communities about achievable, implementable, but still kind of positive visionary policies, they need to have a degree of political achievability in the Australian political system.
Okay, who's next? Hang on. Okay, you come up. You have to come up.
I'm sorry, I'm going to sell out. What can I say?
I'm Alice, and my question is, looking at political reality, how are we going to get rid of the Liberal government in order to do this thing? But that's brief enough for me.
Who wants to answer? It's a debate among the Liberals.
Yeah, that's a big question, right? I feel, obviously the Labor Party's in shell shock after the election and is sort of stumbling around at the moment trying to work out how to reposition themselves. I think as I started to say, I feel like people can overinterpret what happened in the last election. A, it was very close. B, from what you could read from the polls, 15 to 20% of people hadn't made their mind up to the last moments. So trying to inscribe too much policy logic around that. I think Bill Shorten apparently seems to have been very unpopular amongst the undecideds. And at the close, they didn't put together a sufficiently compelling vision for enough people to vote for them. The undecideds, in the end, there was enough of them that could walk in and keep this government just in power. It's an utterly moribund government, though. They're not really. It's just every week is a different sort of old white man's grievance. There's a series of crises building up around them. Yeah. Okay.
Well, then I'll hand over.
Well, I agree with Chris's analysis. My view is the way you get rid of a decrepit, moribund, corrupt government is, first of all, you point that out. And I think they're doing a fair bit of that themselves. Like, you know, they're demonstrating through their own actions all of those attributes. But the second thing we need a positive alternative vision. And, you know, Labor has taken the lesson, or seems to be in the process of learning this false lesson from the most recent federal election, that, they were too visionary, that they had too many positive policies. Well, I don't think that's the lesson to take at all. I think they had, when it comes to climate change, they were trying to narrow cast an ambiguous message to Queensland and try and say, oh, well, we kind of support coal and we kind of support climate change. If you're in Brisbane, we support climate change action. If you're in the regions, we kind of support coal. But they didn't really commit to either, and nobody believed them. And then they ran a slightly different message down in Melbourne, a slightly different message in Sydney, because, and I think I said earlier, I don't believe people are mugs. I think people can see politicians when they're bullshitting to them and they don't have a plan and they're not really in their corner. And I'd say the same goes for the sort of slightly embarrassed way in which they sold their policy on franking credits, and the slightly embarrassed way in which they made a sort of commitment to have an inquiry into New Start rather than a commitment to increase New Start. If you don't actually believe in anything, well then people aren't going to believe in you and they're not going to vote for you. So I'm firmly of the view the way we get rid of a rotten government is to expose how rotten they are. But more fundamentally, you need the positive alternative vision. You need to believe in it. You need to campaign for it, not for 6 months, but for 3 years.
Oh, thanks very much for the speakers. It was really fantastic what you talked about. Yeah, just following on the politics of it. I mean, how do we create an alternative vision that's going to win people over? I'm absolutely, totally in favour of the concept of a just transition and winning over the coal communities and all that, but I don't think myself, for a vision for Australia, that can be your number one problem. The number one problem is, how do you win over the youth? How do you win over the general community? And on September 20, we saw what is the future. We saw the high school students, and I think that the Labor movement and the Green movement and the Progressive movement has to focus on that. That is the future. I don't like to use the topic of Luddites, but it is not going to be the case that the transition from coal to alternative jobs in the Hunter Valley and in central Queensland is going to be the centre of the solution. We need to focus on the 90% of the population that is going to be absolutely destroyed by climate change, and we have to win them over. There's like 100,000 jobs on the Gold Coast, to do with the Barrier Reef tourism, and we're told there's a total of 40,000 jobs in coal in the whole country. So, you know, I think somehow we've got to sort of recast this discussion, and I'm not saying that we can't actually talk about the just transition for the actual existing coal communities, but we need a just transition for the entire country and for the whole workforce and the people and the farmers that are suffering from drought, and the Aboriginal communities and the communities in the small towns that are suffering from the destruction of the rivers. So yeah, I think somehow it's not, I'm not denigrating this question of the just transition for the existing coal communities, but we've got to fit that within an overall framework for a just transition for the entire society, including 90% of the Australian working class. So I just think, well, my question is how, it's more of a statement, do you think that we need to fit the just transition as a broader framework than just a transition for the existing relatively small communities? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think we probably did, in this case, narrow in on one part of what a just transition is. I mean, a just transition involves, for example, ensuring that low-income households across Australia aren't left out of the benefits and where the costs of an energy transition. I think we can do both. I think we need to do both. We're focused, I guess, in terms of just transition. The coal question has sort of come into relief very sharply after the election, when there was clearly a reaction in regional Queensland and in the Hunter as well, with One Nation at 25% of the vote, and a bit of complacency. So I guess from the perspective of the Labor Party, they're trying to get 77 seats, and they're saying if we can't get some seats in regional Queensland, how do we get elected? And so they're trying to work through the contradictions of that. Possibly. I think the answer, we can and must do both, and I agree it shouldn't be, the transition can't get held up purely on the coal question, but I think we can do both.
Yeah.
Well, I agree we need to do both. But I suppose I'm going to disagree with part of the premise you put to us, which is that there's kind of communities and working people who should be sacrificed for this transition. And I don't buy into that. And I actually think if you go into the transition on the assumption that there's a subset of the community that's going to pay a harsh and unfair price for the transition, well, that's not the kind of transition I want to buy into. I don't believe we should just, like we did with the textile and footwear industry, or what we did with the car industry, and just say, well, do you know what, you're going to pay the price. The rest of us are all going to benefit, and you're going to pay the price. Well, if we all are going to benefit, and we all agree that we're all going to benefit from the transition, well, we should collectively help those people who are going to pay the price. And that just seems to me to be a basic sense of fairness in the transition. So, but I think what I take away from your comment, which I agree with, is if we're not careful, we get trapped into a discourse where all we're talking about is the costs. And that's what we don't want to, all the costs of transition as opposed to the benefits of transition. And there's all those other associated benefits of transition. You know, my God, what happened how terrible it would be if we spent the next 20 years building public transport, re-greening our cities, getting rid of the air pollution from coal, putting in place, solid public jobs, rebuilding TAFE, rebuilding the public sector. Imagine if we all did that and there was and all because climate change was a hoax. Well, if it's a hoax that produces those outcomes, I'm in. Well, I think we should be careful about being trapped in that discussion too much about simply looking at the parts of the community that are going to pay the price. But I don't believe we should abandon them. Of course, we should have that broader discussion about who wins. And when it comes to young people, when it comes to that part of the community that already see the need, we've kind of won them all over already. I don't think there are many people who joined that 100,000 odd people marching in Sydney, and more shame on them in Melbourne. I don't think there's many of them who are voting for the college.
They haven't joined unions.
Sure.
Okay, that's it. You're next.
That's a separate question.
Hillary, I just wondered, thinking about the transition, holding Germany up as the gold standard, and talking about in the past where industries have closed down, a third have been able to get comparable jobs, a third have retired, and a third have been unemployed. What was the situation in Germany where there was a lot of planning?
There's a lot of retirement.
There were a lot of retirements, but they were done on good terms. I think there were essentially no forced redundancies. So they were actually able to manage the transition, and very large-scale transitions, particularly going back in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't done for climate change reasons. But the more recent ones, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think they're proud boasters. There were no forced redundancies. They managed to redeploy everyone essentially. They were a very proud record of that.
And part of the discussion we should have about a just transition is actually committing to no forced redundancies, like a guaranteed commitment to redeployment on the same terms in another industry. If you make that a political commitment, that's kind of something you can understand at the workplace. There will be no forced redundancies. If you lose this particular job, you'll get a job on the same terms somewhere else. But yeah, there was a huge amount of retirement. Chris gave the demographics, the difference in the demographics between the coal industry in Germany and the coal industry in here, you can't give people a redundancy package when they're 33 that's going to see them through, but you could in Germany.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
In these other countries, John, in these other countries like Germany, the gold standard, was it used as a political football? Or are these other countries, because that's what's ripping this place apart, it's being used to win elections. You've got one party that's uses refugees and carbon tax, as they kept going on about. So that's the first thing. And second, can I have a comment on Adani? Well, it's going ahead apparently. Do you feel it's going ahead, or is this just a big hoax that they're reaping some money out of us but never going to produce anything out of it? I hope they don't.
I think the answer to your first question is the political climate's very different. There are still major political divisions. The Coal Commission agreement still, there's 38 members, but it's not pure consensus. There are people, environmental activists, who are unhappy with the time frame, for example. I think it's too long, 2038, potentially 2035. At the other end, some of the representatives in the brown coal regions are unhappy with it. So it's not like there's a pure consensus and no one's engaged in political arguments and so on, but it's still political argumentation within a shared acceptance that there's going to be a closure, and it's not the level of polarisation here where a political party has built its identity bizarrely around a mineral. So that obviously makes a very different context. Is Adani going to go ahead? I don't know. I think for a long bit time the view is the underlying economics are not there and that it won't proceed. If there's enough subsidy, anything could proceed is the answer. So,
yeah. I think we need to operate on the assumption that it will go ahead unless we continue to campaign and mobilise against it. That's the assumption we should make with Adani. Look, I otherwise agree with Chris's observations. Germany has a different political culture because they've got a different political system. I mean, they have a political system that normally isn't a kind of winner-takes-all approach. They're almost always having to have a kind of coalition in order to get a majority to form government. That tends to produce a much more mature political culture than it has over time in Germany. We see the same in New Zealand, you know, a political culture that's generated by better political design, where the people who are elected to the House of Government actually reflect the voting intentions more closely and allow for diversity of voices to form a majority in the chamber. Produces a better political culture, which you don't worry about here.
What about undeniable?
My name's Bruce. Question to David. Has the Hunter Valley Research Foundation been cooperative in what the Greens are doing about coal in the Hunter Valley?
Yeah. The Hunter Valley Research Foundation. We haven't engaged directly, and one of my jobs, I've picked up the energy spokes role since April. One of my jobs after we put some further fine grain in our proposals is to get out and do that sort of regional consultation with one of my colleagues, Abigail Boyd, who's just been recently elected as a Greens MP in the Upper House, and she's the mining spokes. We were planning on doing that towards the second half of this year, but politics went a bit nuts in New South Wales for a while there, and it threw some of our plans out. But over the next year, our plans are to get out there and do that more fine-grained consultation in the Hunter, in Central Coast, and particularly in the Illawarra. Sorry, in the Illawarra, there actually are some positive moves in the Illawarra, which I think make it quite distinct. You've got particularly, I think, quality union leadership coming from the South Coast Labor Council down there. They've run that Union Town campaign. They committed just in the last week to addressing the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis. They committed to being a part of building the renewable energy future, and they committed to working with civil society and their members to drive a positive climate message in the Illawarra. So, you know, it's a little bit different to the Hunter, where the unions are a little bit, are less on board the climate change messaging. But in the Illawarra, I think it's a great case study for how you can actually join up the environmental movement and the union movement to build a sort of broad-ranging commitment for climate action. Yeah, good counsel too, you're right.
Okay. Thank you. My name's Ken Cregan. Question for both of you. I like your plans, they're great, and the analysis. Do they go far enough? There's more to climate change than just renewable energy. We've got a serious water problem with the Murray-Darling system. There's a way that this could be incorporated into it. You're talking about the miners, young and committed to mining, hard to retrain them. They'd be good for tunnelling, and not only used for transport, rail and so on, but also for water and for building hydro storage. Because we can use the solar power to desalinate and raise water by vaporising it. A technology that's not looked into too much, but water has an amazing characteristic. It can be desalinated and raised at the same time. And so it could be raised to a high level in the upper reaches of the Murray-Darling and could flow down through tunnels and earthworks. On the way down, it could be stored, and then it could be used to regenerate again through hydropower. So I see a way that these workers, these miners, could be put into these sorts of infrastructure works and solve a bigger picture to do with climate change. So that's just the one part of it. So I'm interested in your views on something like that.
Do you want me to get started, or do you just there's a challenge for us?
Well, I mean, first of all, one of the reasons I focused on the energy sector was because I had 20 minutes. And obviously climate change and addressing the challenge of climate change cuts across all industries, in fact all facets of our life. In fact, you might even say it challenges the whole capitalist system. I personally believe that. But so we just needed to constrain the presentation tonight. But of course you're right. If you're talking about a Green New Deal, it involves a hell of a lot more than just the energy sector. It involves the agriculture sector. It involves our basic our commitment to sort of increased endless consumption. It involves waste. I mean, there's all of those elements need to be packaged up in a Green New Deal. In terms of your views about water, you know, you're dead right. Water's an amazing substance, and it has all of those features. Whether or not it's viable to produce that kind of large-scale engineering project to actually take seawater, evaporate it, put it over the Great Dividing Range, and then whack it into the Murray-Darling system. I'm not convinced of it. I haven't seen identifiable projects about how it could happen. But if I could see a way of doing that, you know, that we wouldn't be averse to it. We are always careful, because of the environmental commitments of the party, to not mess with our major ecosystems too much, to actually try and work within the constraints that nature gave us, rather than try and geoengineer a solution outside of that. So there is that minor caveat with it.
My name's Susan. I was just wanting to talk about your idea of presenting a positive structure and something that perhaps sells more. And I think given that the young people are protesting, kids at school and kids under 18, and they're already very cynical about politicians in general. In fact, they rarely read a newspaper, and could say they're pretty uninformed about political, politicians in general. So really you need to present an image, and given that the main media never promotes the positive story for action on climate change, so that I think that was part of the problem with Labor, that they did present a wishy-washy campaign trying to appeal to different people, and then giving an ambiguous message. I'm sure that I think that had a large part in their loss. So you need to, can you think of a way that you can structure the packaging of a great alternative plan that directly respects young people and provides them with an advocacy body so that they can be, as they're getting towards 18, they're already really strongly given the tools to start to be, instrumental in changing things, through their voting and present them with the alternative thing through their education or reaching them through alternative media.
Well, I think the climate strikes and the movement are that. I don't think formal institutions are likely to work. I think participation in formal forums and institutions has been declining for a long time, and social media and other things like that have become such a large part of everyone's life, let alone young people. And I think that the exciting part of seeing climate strikes and these movements is seeing a whole new generation learning collective action and learning all those things. And I think that's, I don't know about formal institutions. I feel like a movement on the streets and online and so on, as it's forming, is probably the most powerful tool there is.
I was just thinking there must be a way to harness all of that energy, because politicians in power at the moment is sort of undermining those young people.
Well, I think there's a gap, and I think what I could identify at the moment is a gap between huge energy, huge public outpourings, young people in particular, highly motivated, highly mobilised, but the gap is between that energy and that mobilisation and actually changing politics. And that's the gap that we kind of need to bridge, and that's, I think, probably what your question is addressed to. How do we turn enthusiasm, support, and I would actually say for most young people, knowledge, like vastly more knowledge there than I see in my workplace. How do you convert that knowledge to an actual political outcome? And that's the gap that's missing, and I agree, that's where we need to do a whole lot more work in actually saying to young people, well, do you know what? We agree with you. We're on your side. This is dead right. This is one option, or these are the ways you can pull the levers of politics to deliver your outcomes. But that is, engaging people in the concept of parliamentary democracy or even elections when they're not super interested in it and they think largely politics has abandoned them. That's the challenge. And it is a challenge. But I think that's our job, surely, as political movements and people engaged in politics, to actually convert mass mobilisation to a political outcome. I get a sense it's happening. I mean, I just spent the last 2 days largely standing with Extinction Rebellion and defending their right to protest, and actually having at least somebody in politics doing that. And I think it's being a solid ally, identifying how politics can be relevant, and also helping to feed and seed that movement with some very real concrete political goals that will convert their enthusiasm to actual outcomes.
Thank you very much. There's one more question. We're getting close to the end here.
Well, Stephen, I was just thinking in terms of a Green New Deal, there are several New Deals we want, I think. And you just talked about one, a protesting New Deal, a democratic New Deal where we have proportional representation, a media New Deal so not everything can be clobbered by Murdoch the moment something raises its head. A human rights New Deal so we haven't got 900 people being held as political hostages on Manus and Nauru, plus not being reported. All sorts of New Deals, actually. I think the Green New Deal is one, but there's a whole lot of New Deals we've got to press for that have got to come as well. So to get a real political dynamic moving, because what we saw it at the beginning with a lot of static on the screen. That's what we've got in the political situation, static. Things are static. And because they're being held in place by Murdoch, among other people, unfortunately, and the huge power that he has. So that's sort of throwing that in, if you'd like to comment. That's my question. Would you like to comment on that?
Rather Murdoch.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are systemic crises on many fronts. aren't there? And it's the frustrations of progressives is that we haven't been able at this point to mobilise a movement that captures all of that and that mobilises people when there's so many crises at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you on one level that all of these things are kind of crucial and urgent at the moment. But I think articulating a Green New Deal that covers the field and actually identifies the kind of social change, economic change, political change that's going to produce the kind of outcomes we want, I think that's what we do. We actually sell a Green New Deal that covers all of those points. It's about democratising politics. It's about empowering people. It's about protecting the future. It's about delivering economic security. It's about delivering security for your housing and shelter. I mean, that's a Green New Deal. It's actually all of those elements. I'm getting a sense of quite legitimate criticism for my presentation on a Green New Deal that I focus too much on the energy sector. I think I think that's a legitimate criticism for my presentation. But I rest assured, when we launch a Green New Deal as a campaign on behalf of the Greens of New South Wales, it'll be a Green New Deal that has those multiple facets to it, because that's the compelling political project that we've got to sell.